As humanity has lived on this planet, you would think by now that we might have a clue as to what's going on with not only our world, but with the other species that reside on this rock. The reality of that statement is there are things that happen all the time that we claim to understand, but actually appear to be outside of our general understanding and knowledge. That one person who was crying in my comments in the last video, he's right. It's your boy Roanoke, who rambles a lot, I suppose. I bring up this point because to not question the things around you and then just assume it's already figured out can actually shut out your mind to the reality of things that are happening right in front of your nose. You just don't see it for what it is. In England, specifically South Devon, a set of footprints would be found meandering through the snowdrifts and through the countryside that would indicate that something rather strange was taking place in that area. What's worse is nobody could figure out what actually left these prints behind. As the residents of South Devon would turn in for the evening, a light snowfall would happen that was typically seen as irregular for the area given the temperate climate. As they awoke the next morning, odd-shaped hoof-like prints would be found jumping up to impossibly high walls, on rooftops, before casually again resuming on the ground, through pipes that were too small for anything to actually have left those prints behind and then actually fit through those pipes, and everything about the prints left behind did just not make any sense. Eventually, there would be those that claimed to know what had actually happened, but taking into consideration what they said along with the other clues surrounding the event, it would just appear as though they were straight up lying. Other suggestions would be made that would imply it was more of a natural event, with just some weird outlying factors that caused people to essentially misidentify prints, but even those would present issues to the credibility of these ideas simply because nothing would have gone that far away. So in today's episode, let's discuss the potentially demonic evidence surrounding the mystery that still to this day has not been fully solved, the Devil's Footprints. But before hopping into it, as you guys know, I do have this in podcast format, and it can be found on all major podcast distributors, even Apple Podcasts, because I keep getting that question a lot, under the name Real Horror with Roanoke Tales. So if you don't want your phone battery completely drained, you can go ahead and check it out there. Also, YouTube apparently has this podcast function now. I have no idea how it works, but I'm going to be looking at that as well. Apart from that, as always, I do really appreciate y'all supporting this channel, and if you enjoy, leaving a like lets YouTube know that it's actually worth telling my subscribers about, and subscribing supposedly lets you know when I post, and it keeps you updated, and also hitting the Notre Dame bell does something too. I have not a clue what it really does. So let's get to it and attempt to understand what this thing is, and potentially what may have left these prints behind. So if you ask me, while humanity is just absolutely dominating this planet, our intelligence has a propensity to make us think somewhat mischievous. In general, Homo sapiens likes to troll a little bit, and its main target is the other humans on this planet. Because we do such things, when the town of South Devon would awake on the morning of February 9th, 1855, a pair of footprints would be immediately the thing that sparked fear and a healthy dose of skepticism as well to what left them behind. Unfortunately, given the time frame that this event would happen in, not enough skepticism would come forth, but hey, that was just the era. As the footprints were discovered in the town, people would become quite curious and would start throwing out ideas about what it could possibly be, and others just wanted to find the thing that made it. Following the footprints in the apparent direction they seemed to be heading, they would twist and wind through the English countryside of Devon. Following them through to the town, people began to realize just how odd of an occurrence it actually was. At first, the footprints just appeared to be like that of a donkey's that may have gotten loose. But as they analyzed the footprints and their style of walking, it became apparent that the movement of this creature that left them would have put it at bipedalism, or basically a two-legged animal. Later, as they kept following them, it would seem like occasionally this animal would descend on all fours again and keep walking, only to stand back up once more. These tracks were in single file, which is strange for most animals to stride like this because typically, like with man, who's bipedal, they sort of fall from side to side as they walk to get the next step in order. These tracks left behind had none of this, and were directly in line with one another. Things from here would continue to get more and more strange. As they continued to follow, people would note a few other things. First, that there were no accompanying human footprints in the snow, meaning that it would be really hard for humans to make these tracks just to trick whoever, happened upon them, so it must have been a single animal. The animal would also do things like approach a haystack, and the footprints would stop and then restart on the other side with the hay remaining non-disturbed. In other areas, a wall that was built to protect the town, which was 14 feet high or 4.26 meters high, had the footprints stop in front of it as more prints were found on top of the wall, and then they descended once more and led away from the town in a straight line like nothing had even been there. Back in the town, hoof prints were found to approach the sides of buildings, go onto the roof, and descend once more after. And even stranger, the hoof prints would approach a pipe that was 6 inches in diameter, and then it would just stop at the edge of the pipe and continue on the other side as if nothing had happened, but there were no prints above it indicating that it stepped over. As people became more and more concerned because this would be really weird, they would continue to follow these prints and begin to form an idea that this thing apparently may have had to have hopped or potentially jumped along at some points, meaning that it could be bipedal or it could be quadrupedal because both things were saying it was. So it could really just walk in any way it wanted to, or it could jump in any way it wanted to. The hoof prints also had another trait that was fairly disturbing to people: the sheer distance that it had to have traveled. Now, there's a fairly large discrepancy with the actual range of tracks, with the lower end likely being the more accurate version of around 40 miles and the more distant range being set to around 100 miles or so. This exists because when they would sort of relay the information, but we'll get to this a little later, some things may have been embellished. But also this range is about 64.3 to 160 kilometers. So all the Chad imperial system versus all the Virgin metric system now know this was quite a bit of distance. So you can see, it might be good to know just how far this actually was, because this could put some pretty severe limitations on what sort of naturally occurring animal it could have been, seeing as an animal that actually did this would have to be determined and on a mission to trek this distance. It doesn't just happen by chance. As others became aware of the footprints and the distance that this thing had apparently walked, hunters would then go out and then claim to have found the same prints in their area as well, meaning that while it seemed like there were no physical connection between the prints, they were the same prints, meaning that whatever it was had to come through that area as well. As the distance the people traversed following the tracks would go on and on and on, a odd occurrence would begin to form, with some of them occasionally popping up that while the hooves were still there, occasionally a claw would be seen attached to the foot, which obviously would throw a wrench in the whole idea that this was just a purely hooved animal. One of the more perplexing parts is they would come to an estuary that was 2 miles in width at its widest point. The hoof prints would approach the water directly and then just appear on the other side in the same even gait as if nothing had actually been in the way. As buzz around this event began to build over the day, a hunter would go out and claim that following the tracks, he followed a mysterious creature into the woods where his dogs were near the area of Dawlish. He would then send his hounds after it, but to no avail, as the dogs would then turn back to him terrified and scared. Now, I'm not one to argue about the woods, right? Unless you've watched any video on this channel, and then you know that's a complete lie about me. So you have several people following these tracks, and this one hunter who apparently had the thing cornered sent dogs after it, and yet couldn't take the shot on it. I don't know about that one, Chief. It seems like a bit of a tall tale. But again, I think the reason is nothing would ever come about this. The man going out talking about what he saw, or the creature, or him finding it, or even trying to hunt it down later, apparently was the thing that got away, but I don't buy that for a second. I think he was just kind of BSing. Anyways, within just a few days, the hoof prints would pique the interest of virtually everyone in the area as people struggled to explain what exactly could have caused it. Where again, even to this day, we're still fairly unsure, but there are some theories that really at the time probably wouldn't have been suggested, but then over time it's kind of like, oh, well, this theory makes sense, whereas this one doesn't. This one has more merit, this one has none at all. Around this time, several newspapers such as the Times and the Illustrated London News would begin publishing letters written by people speculating on what exactly this creature could be. But it wasn't all fun and games to pin the tail on the Satan. Many people were outright terrified by the appearance of the hoof prints and then the lack of information that came with it. The unfortunate thing about the human mind is if we don't have enough information on the subject and something cannot quickly be explained, like an event taking place, our minds tend to run a little wild, which in turn, if you get enough of us together that are espousing horrible things that it could be, this can induce anxiety, seeing as we are social creatures. It was a great survival technique, seeing as if you thought something was worse than it actually was, you were not likely to go into that area, for instance. Or, attempt to fist fight a short-faced bear. You're just not going to do it because in your mind, you're like, that's probably really bad. But who knows? Maybe you could have taken out a 13-foot-tall short-faced bear. I don't know. So if you survived in the face of lack of information, it's better to assume the world is a horrible place than it is to pretend that it's great and everything's fine. So there were around these times 2 lines of thought on the hoof prints, depending on how educated you were. It's good to see that nothing has changed for our absolute Chad-like species. There were those who were the less educated, and they were in turn more superstitious. They saw the hoof prints as something to be afraid of, and they would go on to assume it was like the work of the devil. This would put people on edge during this time frame because they were already largely disturbed by what was happening in their environment already, which we'll get into in a second, and this would cause people to stop going out after dark and then locking down their homes at night, which, I mean, then again, that's not really like that bad of a thing, but also this would induce something of a panic amongst people as they would turn to their church leaders for guidance who, regrettably, would not have much information, as some priests would even turn to just making up a mundane explanation just to calm the masses. Those that were more educated were by default less superstitious as well. Studying the hoof prints and the surrounding area, as mentioned, they would spot occasionally like a claw mark in the snow, and that was kind of breaking the hoof mold, but only on one side. So they assumed at this point that surely this must be some form of animal, and it was likely nothing supernatural. Their conclusion on the matter would range, however, from some suggesting that maybe it was like an untethered balloon to a swan who escaped that may have been wearing padded shoes, or even some native fauna in the area like otters or badgers, with some of the more out there being like a monkey escaped from a zoo or maybe a kangaroo, which, I mean, that one seems a little more far-fetched than Satan himself coming to hang out. And the more odd was blaming the weather or even possibly a UFO being the culprit for the prints. That particular postulation seems like the guy was somewhat educated, but by the guy from like Ancient Aliens who's slowly getting abducted if his hair is anything to go off of. Anyhow, now the weather suggestion does have some merit to sort of inducing the whole issue to a degree. Around this time, there was a period where the weather was just in general colder, like way colder than it is today. And not because of like the rise in carbon emissions or anything like that, but it's known as the Little Ice Age. The Little Ice Age has been cited as the period between roughly about 1500 AD and just prior to the 1900s. And then prior to 1500 AD, there was actually the medieval warming period, which some people go on to say that it was much warmer than it was right now, but that's not what we find historically. Anyways, it doesn't matter. Just know there was an ice age there that was a very, very minor ice age for about 400 years. There are several suggestions as to why this happened, but the ultimate result was declining temperatures and much more snow than normal, as well as a pretty large shift in growing seasons for areas such as North America and Europe. Based on evidence, it seems like there may have been a lower amount of sunspots on the sun at this point in time, and due to this, the Earth received less energy than normal. As the Earth slightly cooled, this slowed the thermohaline flow in the oceans, and this is a cycle that essentially has warmer currents heading north on the surface of the ocean, which brings heat to areas like northern areas of North America and Europe. As the heat is offloaded in the north, the water will then sink as its temperature falls and salinity increases, which will then flow back towards the equator, where it's heated up once more. This cycle increases the length of growing seasons by making areas more temperate at higher latitudes, and the winters less severe than they would be otherwise. For this several hundred-year period, however, this cycle slowed. With less warm water going to the north, this would cause winters to be much colder, and with it, increased snowfall. One year, actually, in 1816, it was referred to the year without a summer. This was due to the fact that a volcanic eruption of Mount Tambora had thrown a lot of ash and sulfur into the atmosphere, which further blocked out the sun's energy and sent the planet into an even colder era. On the shores of Lake Superior, ice was found on its shores in June, and it even ended up snowing in July in Washington, D.C. People would absolutely lose their minds nowadays, but these strange weather patterns would persist until the warmer areas of South Devon would also end up seeing snow in 1855. A lot of people point to this fact as a way to show that this wasn't really a supernatural event, but people were just not prepared to see what they saw in the snow. Typically, if you think about it, animals are walking around a lot and it's not really that big of a deal. And unless there's some mud in the area where you can see the tracks, you may not be used to seeing tracks on the ground or tracks that go for like 40 miles to 100 miles. With the snow having fallen and the accompanying tracks that appeared strange, it's completely possible that most people were just not prepared to see those tracks in the snow. People began to say that it couldn't be anything as nothing walks like this, but again, remember, donkeys, as mentioned earlier, well, they walk in straight lines similar to what is seen. This led to the more educated to suggest that it was probably just a loose donkey, but the snow had put some others on edge as those who weren't used to the tracks were basically overreacting. Open and shut, right? Well, obviously not. You see, the loose donkey theory is actually a pretty good one, as it could explain the tracks over a small area that is also flat. But you have to take into consideration walls and roofs and hoof prints, and where they were found, and hay, and A donkey is likely not going to be winning any climbing awards anytime soon as a species, and I'm also inclined to believe people would probably have heard a donkey on their roof, so they might end up checking that out in the middle of the night and seeing what's going on. I don't know, maybe that's just me if I heard banging on my roof. But this heightened cold could also have had a similar impact on animals in the area as well, because much like how it would alter human behavior, it would also alter animal behavior as well, which was used to help explain how, like, the source of the prints could be very much so corporeal. The first to be suggested as the culprit was potentially an otter. The tracks themselves would appear around areas where there was a body of water, or at least one relatively close by. So the line of thinking became, well, if it's near water, maybe it was just an otter coming inland, and it's coming in all this way because it's looking for food because it's colder than normal. And this line of thinking actually did hold some water. Otters can also be fairly good climbers and do possess claws on their feet, but the way they move, with being hoof-like and roughly about 16 inches apart from one another, this would quickly rule them out. Another species was the badger, but again, it went along the same lines of issue as the otter. The prints just did not match, and there were too many breaks in the areas. And for a lot of these areas, the prints would actually just disappear and pick back up like a few yards away, indicating that whatever it was had to be big enough to just jump that distance, and it could not just be like a small mammal. The next hypothesis was that it was a swan, as mentioned earlier. The swan may have had its feet wrapped in something which, could have altered how the feet looked when it left behind a print. Obviously, a print left behind would be more blunted if it was wrapped, but it could also explain the areas where there were no tracks left behind, as then they would pick back up again further on. Because obviously, for it to do that, it would probably need to be able to fly. This actually gained more traction when a swan was captured down in St. Denis near Paris, roughly about 5 days after the footprints appeared. This swan had escaped from some royalty in Germany, and it had coverings on its feet due to it damaging ornamental gardens and lawns. However, it was highly unlikely this swan would have flown up to Devon, walked 40 to 100 miles, only to take off again and be found in France. To be honest, none of these sound correct if you take into account something like it had to walk that distance. Other ideas were raised that maybe it was a toad. Yeah, a toad. A toad hopped a minimum 40 miles in the middle of the night in the snow, and all the strange occurrences past that point were just other toads that decide to join in on the fun. Others said it was probably just mice, but again, 14-foot wall that had to be like hopping the whole time. And what I find most bizarre is it doesn't just appear to be random. The animal picked a direction and kept going as if it was compelled to. I mean, don't get me wrong, animals choose to migrate all the time, but after doing some research on this, there are no known migration patterns in that area at that time of February. Anything small enough to be making these tracks would freeze in those temperatures. Like, a toad is going to freeze in those temperatures. A mouse is going to freeze in those temperatures in the middle of the night. So whoever suggested that, I don't know. Maybe they were like a hat maker or something. Too much mercury in the brain. A kangaroo at one point was also cited as a possibility because, I mean, if it had to jump, right? But then it turned out that that was just made up by a priest who was just trying to calm the fears of his congregation, and others believed also it was a monkey who escaped from the carnival who made that fateful excursion one night. I still think it would freeze, but no body of a monkey was ever found, and with the tracks just suddenly ending, not much would be discovered. This started to cast doubt on the animal theory because anything that was large enough to traverse that distance would not have just disappeared and would not have been able to crawl its way onto houses or across a 14-foot wall without anybody noticing, and anything small enough to cross those boundaries by climbing those barriers and not making any noise would not have the mass to carry them that far in that short of a time frame. Every suggestion seemed to have a drawback. The next idea to be raised was an experimental balloon being the culprit for the devil's footprints. Allegedly, a balloon was kept at a naval base in Devonport dockyard where it would get loose of its bindings as it began its journey across the countryside. Some of the restraints had made it with it on this trek, as the bindings would dip into the snow occasionally, which would leave behind these hoof-like prints. These shackles making contact with the snow is apparently what may have been the actual cause. A man named Geoffrey Household was a novelist at this time, and he would claim this as he had spoken to a major named Carter. Now, this is a massive game of telephone because the major had apparently heard this story from his granddad, who was an employee at Devonport Base. Carter's granddad would tell him that apparently they hushed it up because the balloon had run into quite a few conservatories and broke the glass of greenhouses and windows. Not wanting to get stuck with the bill, they just sort of let it go and decided not to say anything about it. So, I mean, that sounds pretty reasonable, right? Well, there was another issue presented with this. while the balloon would be capable of being whisked upwards on roofs and over walls and ollieing over a buried pipe area. So the question on everyone's mind was, how was it able to move through wooded areas and not become entangled by the trees and limbs and bushes and all this? It was a complete mystery. Along with that, when you take into consideration that there were no signs of any ropes hanging down that would have left the prints in the snow as well, this idea quickly falls apart. Because along with that, if the shackles were making contact with the ground, then they were also being pulled, but these prints appeared to just go straight down, indicating that it was not being dragged and there was no dragging motion that they could see. So, if it doesn't really appear to be like an animal that would leave these marks all over the place, and the actual motion of the hoof prints doesn't appear to be due to some random behavior of wind moving a balloon, then what is the usual suspect? It's humans. It's always humans. Now take this with a grain of salt, because this isn't confirmed, because it's not like we can really confirm something like a story or this event. But there are two hypotheses that have arisen to explain what this is, and then why humans just completely screwing with one another. And I give you two reasons right now. A, because it's fun, and two, because we can. Around this time, there may have been a bit of a religious dunking on one another back and forth between the Puritans and the Catholics. I mean, what else is new, I suppose? Essentially, there were those who were pushing for more visual and traditional forms of service in church, and now we'll call that it's all well and good, but a lot of Puritans did not appreciate this push, as they saw it as basically just Catholicism light. They wanted church service to remain about God and the Bible, which is incredibly based, unfathomably, some might say. So this would create a bit of a schism between the high church followers of the Oxford persuasion and the low church Anglicans. The Puritans at this point, now viewing those who wish to have these traditional services with medieval elements crammed into their service, suspected this had nothing to do with God and instead was about people trying to bring glory to themselves. So they would lump these people in being in league with the devil. From here, it's pretty easy to see the connection. The Puritans would go out in the middle of the night and fake these hoof prints. The meaning was to show that the devil was a part of the high church and the hoof prints were visible at their churches. Now, it sounds like something humans would do, but again, we struggle with the wall and the footprints on the buildings. It is entirely possible that those who own the buildings itself will put the prints up there, but you have to ask yourself, wouldn't it have made more sense just to put the tracks straight to the actual church instead of just through the yard and then to the rest of the town? And even with that being done, you still have to wonder why all these people would wander out into the darkness of night in the frigid cold for tens of miles just to have them suddenly end. And even further to that point, where were the tracks that they left over when the area was, they put all their prints and then just headed out? They didn't have any tracks from humans. I think the Puritan suggestion helps to somewhat explain, but there is more to it, as context clues surrounding it continue to make no sense. Some would even claim later that the Puritans really didn't do any of this, and instead, they would just use the chaos to hurl insults about the things that they didn't like about the church that was trying to change. And now that is a very, very human thing. So now on the other side of this is the original set of hoof prints were actually left and may have been co-opted by Puritans later, as then they added to the amount that was there that everybody was seeing, as some of the hoof prints were then brought up right to the doors of churches that they disagreed with, and also there were hoof prints found between grave sites. This in particular seems to be the work of man, specifically to cast shade on another group that doesn't actually believe what they believe. Definitely a human classic, but the original hoof prints, where may those have come from still? The last and most widely believed hypothesis is that they may have arisen from a group of Romani people. In the book, In the Life of a Romani Gypsy, it is postulated that the hoof prints were planned for several months. Now, even with this, there are some discrepancies, as it says the prints were going through another place entirely, but the author, Manfred Frederick Wood, goes on to say that his memory over the time may have distorted a little bit, and that's entirely possible. As we age, our memory gets worse, and then he wrote this autobiography. But he claims a group of 400 Romani used stilts in order to traverse the landscape, which if 400 people each took a tenth of a mile, and it truly did only go about 40 miles, it's possible that this could have been accomplished rather easily in one night. But then you have 400 people, right? There's gonna be footprints all over the place. It still doesn't make much sense. But under the cover of darkness, the Romani used stilts to accomplish this task, which would have them basically separated from the ground using the stilts, and that allowed them to continue walking in the night. Now, things back in the day during nighttime were much darker than they are now. There are no street lamps, or there are, but they're not as strong as our street lamps nowadays. So if a group were to do this, If they were quiet enough, then they may be able to accomplish it. The roof prints could also have been placed there using like a stick, as well as a similar size detached hoof to their own stilt. The thinking was that the Romani at this time were starting to divide up amongst two schools of thought: the old religion and Christianity. In the old religion, there was essentially a devil in disguise of a dead man. Some felt they were having their territory encroached upon, and they would use this devil in disguise to essentially clear out the area of the people that they didn't like. In the book, it is stated that this took many months of planning, as mentioned earlier, and the building of stilts was highly precise. The strides were made intentionally odd and in a way that could not be easily explained because it would sow more chaos, and those that they wanted gone, and I'm about to butcher the way this is pronounced. It's either pickies or pikeys, I'm going to say that. But the amount of information contained within the autobiography has enough detail that would make you think that it does seem apparent that they were the orchestrator behind the hoof prints, but there were issues contained within the recount as well. The first is that the stilts actually used boots instead of hooves, so that's already a bit of a problem. The Romani also were said to be in a different area entirely, and they also didn't mind being seen as they threw a sheet over themselves to pretend to be the devil. But nobody was seen in Devon, and even animals in the area didn't bark or didn't bay or make a bunch of noise to acknowledge just 400 people happening by to basically put hoof prints all over the place. However, with that said, there was the occasional extra hole near the hoof print that couldn't be explained, and it may possibly indicate a stabilizing stick being used. Everything appears to have some critical flaw that separates it from the possibility of it being 100% on point with what the actual cause is. That said, there is one absolutely cracked out hypothesis that holds no weight whatsoever, but you have to listen to it because I had to read about it, and it is absolutely insane. The other theory that caused the tracks was a weather event. It's about to get magical. The theory goes like this. Because it was colder than normal, air currents that were warm had a much stronger impact around the immediate area. These warm air currents could get trapped by the colder air, which would cause them to swirl and start producing condensation in the cold air. And I'm not talking about like a tornado. I'm talking about an air column that does go up to the sky, but is only like a few feet at its like widest, I suppose is the best way to put it. This condensation would fall as rain highly localized to the ground, and I'm talking just a few feet above the ground, which would then melt the snow, leaving behind these prints. Yes, this is the actual line of thinking. If this is to be believed as to what had happened, it could help to explain its movement up and over obstacles. As to when, that's not much of an issue. It has been stated that it travels in straight lines, but it looks like snowshoe marks rather than a contained hoof prints, and on top of that, it's more sporadic in how it messes with the snow as it's not as uniform. So the thing I have to tell you is, yes, apparently this is an actual event that can happen, but it seemed a little far-fetched. It could help to explain its jump across areas, but the main issue is it does not usually travel 40 to 100 miles. A man has claimed to see this event himself, named Rennie, up in Canada in the 1920s. He saw tracks forming in front of him, which would probably be a little scary, as it moved closer and closer until he was hit with the warmer air, which immediately left condensation on him, which is why he suggests this is what it was. So, what actually caused the prints then? I'm in good company on this one because, like most things in life, it's usually not one singular factor that leads to something. Instead, there is the initial push that then people want to be a part of. Obviously, to track down all those prints, people didn't do it all in one day, and they kept finding more. It's more likely that while the prints at first could have been a natural phenomenon, as word traveled, more and more details became embellished, and people wanted to add in more to the story to make it more interesting. Like a fish that goes from like 6 inches to a 2-footer to a 600-pound catfish that they had to wrestle out of the water themselves. It seems like maybe the obstacles may have been added as to like, oh, it had to traverse this, even though it was like a small wall of like a foot, or possibly over like a small shed or firewood cover, to then just traversing 14-foot walls and on top of roofs. But by then, others began to join in and make more footprints, and they kind of just kept going, and they kept doing weirder and weirder things. So even since 1855, also, those prints have appeared several more times, and it causes less of a stir, but people still attempt to keep the dream alive. I think personally it's a combination of an animal likely making the first few, and then the story growing out of control from there, and ultimately humanity jumping in to sow more chaos. Because it's not like we wouldn't just totally screw around with one another, right? With the joys of anonymity? Of course we would. So I'm saying human. Definitely human. probably just a regular animal at first. Maybe it was a donkey that wandered through, but then the other things that started happening, I believe it was probably human. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be fantastic, as it helps out with the algorithm, and Lord knows that's the name of the game on this site. And subscribing lets you know when I upload weekly. I also want to hear what you guys think about this thing. Like, what? Give me your idea of what you think it is. Because, I mean, it could have been somebody riding a donkey and then just kind of making more. It's very confusing. I'm not 100% certain. But do you think it was some unknown animal? Do you think it was an alien? Do you think it was human activity? Do you think it was Satan himself? Who knows? But just let me know in the comments. But all right, that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and we'll see y'all in the next one.